The winter air over a British naval harbour in late 1946 is sharp and quiet. Grey warships sit motionless at their moorings, their paint dulled, their decks stripped of urgency. These vessels had crossed oceans under fire only months earlier. They had guarded supply lines, projected power, and upheld the image of an empire that ruled the seas. Now, they wait for orders that will never come. Inside government offices far from the docks, a different kind of decision is being made. No surrender documents, no public announcements. Just ledgers, balance sheets, and calculations that lead to one unavoidable conclusion. Britain cannot afford its navy anymore. What follows is not a story of military defeat. It is the story of how victory revealed bankruptcy and how naval power, once the backbone of empire, became a financial burden Britain could no longer carry. To understand why this matters, we need to step back. For more than 3 centuries, Britain's strength rested on the sea. Control of trade routes, protection of colonies, and the ability to move force across the globe all depended on the Royal Navy. It was not just a military institution. It was an economic system, a political symbol, and a psychological reassurance that Britain remained a great power. World War II seemed to confirm that legacy. Britain survived. It fought on when much of Europe fell. Its navy protected Atlantic convoys and enabled global coordination. On paper, Britain emerged on the winning side. But victory came at a price few fully grasped in 1945. The war drained Britain's financial reserves to historic lows. Overseas investments were liquidated to pay for food, fuel, and weapons. Foreign currency holdings collapsed. Industrial infrastructure was worn down. Civilian consumption had been suppressed for years, and rebuilding would require enormous spending. Most critically, Britain was deeply in debt. Not just ordinary debt, but structural debt owed abroad, denominated in foreign currency, and tied to post-war obligations. Wartime arrangements that had kept Britain alive were now coming due. The empire still existed on maps, but the economic engine that sustained it was exhausted. The Navy reflected this contradiction perfectly. On paper, Britain possessed one of the largest fleets in the world. In reality, maintaining it required fuel, crews, dockyards, overseas bases, and constant modernization. Ships built for wartime conditions were expensive to operate in peacetime. New threats demanded new technology, and Britain no longer had the resources to do both: rebuild at home and police the world's oceans. This is where the first major turning point begins. In 1945 and 1946, naval planners and treasury officials found themselves in quiet conflict. Admirals argued for maintaining global reach. Economists looked at the numbers and saw something else entirely. Every additional ship meant fewer resources for food imports, housing, construction, and industrial recovery. The problem was not ideology. It was arithmetic. Britain faced a hard choice: preserve naval dominance and risk economic collapse, or shrink its fleet and accept a reduced global role. Publicly, leaders spoke of transition and modernization. Privately, they confronted the reality that the Navy, once the source of Britain's wealth, was now consuming what little financial strength remained. Scrapping ships was the fastest way to save money. Warships were decommissioned at a scale unseen in modern British history. Some were sold, others were broken down for scrap. Overseas bases were reconsidered. Entire categories of naval capability were quietly downgraded or abandoned. This was not framed as a sale of power. It was framed as rationalization. But rationalization had consequences. Each ship removed from service represented more than steel and machinery. It meant fewer patrols, less influence in distant waters, greater reliance on allies. The Navy had been Britain's insurance policy against decline. Without it, the empire's edges became harder to defend economically as much as militarily. At the same time, the British public was largely unaware of how dire the situation had become. Wartime unity lingered. Victory celebrations masked austerity. The Navy still appeared impressive during ceremonial reviews, even as its operational footprint shrank. The illusion of continuity held for a while. But beneath the surface, Britain's post-war future was being reshaped by debt. Naval assets were no longer symbols of confidence. They were line items to be reduced. Decisions once made by admirals were now constrained by accountants. This shift marked a profound change in how Britain understood power. For centuries, naval strength had enabled economic prosperity. Now, economic weakness was dictating naval retreat. The relationship had reversed, and this reversal would accelerate, because selling ships was only the beginning. What followed would force Britain to confront how deeply its imperial model depended on money it no longer had, and how quickly naval supremacy could turn into a liability when the bills came due. That is where the next phase of this story begins. By 1947, the consequences of Britain's post-war finances could no longer be contained within internal memos and cabinet discussions. The strain was spreading quietly, but relentlessly across every institution tied to Britain's global reach. And nowhere was that strain more visible than in the Navy itself. The war had ended, but Britain remained locked into wartime obligations. Food still had to be imported. Fuel still had to be paid for in foreign currency. Reconstruction demanded steel, labor, and capital. Yet Britain's ability to earn dollars, the currency that now mattered most, was dangerously limited. This was the hidden pressure behind every naval decision. Maintaining a global fleet required overseas bases stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, from the Caribbean to the Far East. Each base meant dock workers, fuel storage, repairs, supply chains, and political commitments. In the pre-war world, these costs had been offset by imperial trade and financial dominance. In the post-war world, they became a drain Britain could no longer disguise. Behind closed doors, officials began to speak in a new language. Not of prestige or deterrence, but of balance of payments. Not of command of the seas, but of hard currency expenditure. Naval deployments were now evaluated less on strategic necessity and more on what they cost in dollars. This shift had profound effects. Entire fleets were reassessed. Ships that were only a few years old were deemed too expensive to modernize. Crews were reduced. Training exercises were scaled back. Maintenance schedules were extended beyond what naval engineers considered safe. The fleet still existed, but it was increasingly hollow. At the same time, Britain's financial dependence deepened. Emergency loans negotiated during and after the war came with conditions. Currency stability mattered. Exports had to rise. Government spending had to be restrained. These were not abstract economic goals. They directly limited how many ships Britain could afford to keep at sea. Every cruiser scrapped freed resources. Every overseas withdrawal reduced expenses. Every base closed improved the balance sheet, even as it shrank Britain's influence. Publicly, the government framed these changes as modernization and efficiency. Privately, there was growing alarm. Naval planners warned that Britain was losing flexibility. Once a ship was scrapped, it could not be quickly replaced. Once a base was closed, returning would be politically and financially costly. The empire had relied on presence. Presence required ships. Ships required money. And money was the one thing Britain no longer controlled. This tension came to a head in debates over specific regions. The Mediterranean, long a symbol of British maritime power, became a financial headache. Keeping ships stationed there required constant fuel imports and costly upkeep. In Asia, maintaining naval forces meant defending long supply lines across oceans Britain could barely afford to traverse. Gradually, Britain began to accept what would have been unthinkable a decade earlier: strategic retreat as economic necessity. Some responsibilities were handed off to allies. Others were simply abandoned. Naval commitments were narrowed to what could be sustained, not what tradition demanded. The Navy was no longer shaping Britain's role in the world. Britain's finances were shaping the Navy. This was not a single decision, but a series of incremental ones. Each appeared reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern of contraction. The human cost inside the Navy was significant. Thousands of sailors were demobilized. Dockyards that had thrived during the war now faced layoffs and closures. Skilled labor dispersed. Institutional knowledge faded. The machinery of maritime power, once finely tuned, began to rust figuratively and literally. Yet the most important consequences lay beyond Britain's shores. As Britain reduced its naval footprint, other powers adjusted. Trade routes were recalculated. Diplomatic expectations shifted. Regions that had relied on British maritime presence for stability began to look elsewhere. The sea lanes did not disappear, but Britain's ability to dominate them did. This is where the story takes on a broader meaning. The Navy had always been Britain's way of turning economic strength into global influence. Now, economic weakness was undoing that conversion. The ships being sold and scrapped were not just tools of war. They were instruments of diplomacy, commerce, and control. Their loss reshaped the post-war order. What made this process especially striking was how quietly it unfolded. There was no dramatic announcement that Britain was relinquishing naval supremacy. No single moment of collapse. Instead, there was a steady narrowing of ambition, driven by financial reality rather than military defeat. By the late 1942, Britain still possessed a navy worthy of respect. But it was no longer a navy built for empire. It was a navy constrained by debt, designed for survival rather than dominance. And the pressures were not easing, because as Britain adjusted its fleet, the demands of a changing world were increasing. New technologies raised costs. New political realities complicated overseas commitments, and the financial obligations that had forced the first round of naval reductions were far from resolved. The question was no longer whether Britain would continue selling off its naval power. The question was how far that process would go and what would be lost before it ended. That question would be answered when economic strain collided with geopolitical crisis, exposing just how fragile Britain's post-war naval position had become. By the early 1952, the consequences of Britain's post-war choices could no longer be described as adjustment. They had become exposure. The slow contraction of naval power, once framed as temporary austerity, was now colliding with a world that no longer waited for Britain to recover. The breaking point did not arrive through a single economic shock. It emerged through a series of crises that revealed how much Britain's margin for action had vanished. At the heart of the problem was a simple imbalance. Britain still thought like a global power, but it could no longer pay like one. Naval planners continued to prepare for worldwide commitments, protecting sea lanes, maintaining influence near strategic waterways, and supporting overseas bases that had anchored Britain's presence for generations. But the resources required to sustain those plans no longer existed. Each deployment strained foreign currency reserves. Each overseas operation risked destabilizing the fragile post-war economy. This contradiction became impossible to ignore when Britain faced situations that demanded decisive maritime action. In moments of international tension, naval strength had once provided flexibility. Ships could be moved quickly. Presence could be established without escalation. Power could be signaled without negotiation. Now, even limited deployments required careful financial justification. Behind every operational decision sat the same question. Can we afford this? The answer was increasingly no. Modern naval warfare was becoming more expensive at precisely the moment Britain was least able to adapt. New technologies demanded greater investment in research, fuel, and training. Older ships, already costly to maintain, were rapidly becoming obsolete. Replacing them required capital Britain did not have. As a result, Britain faced a damaging cycle. To save money, ships were scrapped. With fewer ships, remaining vessels were used more intensively. That increased wear and maintenance costs. Maintenance delays reduced readiness. Reduced readiness weakened deterrence. And weakened deterrence made crises more likely. This was not decline in theory. It was decline in practice. The human dimension of this collapse was evident within the Navy itself. Career paths narrowed. Expertise drained away. Dockyards that had been centers of innovation during the war became symbols of contraction. Skills built over decades were lost in a matter of years. At the same time, Britain's allies and rivals took note. Naval power is not just about ships, it is about credibility. As Britain's fleet shrank, so did expectations of what Britain could realistically enforce. Diplomatic influence, once backed by the certainty of maritime presence, began to erode. This erosion became starkly visible when Britain attempted to act as it had in the past. In situations where naval pressure was intended to shape outcomes, Britain found itself constrained by economic reality and dependent on external support. Operations that once would have been routine now carried unacceptable financial and political risk. This was the moment when the illusion finally cracked. Britain had not lost a war. It had won one. But the cost of that victory had stripped it of the very tools it once used to shape the post-war world. The Navy symbol of continuity, stability, and command had become a reminder of what could no longer be sustained. Those who benefited from this shift were clear. Other powers, less burdened by debt and equipped with newer fleets, filled the gaps Britain left behind. Trade routes continued to function, but under different guardianship. Strategic waterways remained vital, but Britain's ability to dictate their security diminished. Those who paid the price were equally clear. Britain lost leverage. Former colonies and partners recalculated their relationships. Domestic industries tied to naval production declined. Communities built around shipbuilding and dockwork faced long-term economic hardship. Perhaps most importantly, Britain lost time. Time to adapt gradually. Time to redesign its role without crisis. Time to reconcile its global identity with its economic limits. By delaying acknowledgement of its reduced capacity, Britain allowed the eventual reckoning to arrive under pressure rather than control. The Navy's contraction was no longer a matter of selling surplus ships. It had become a structural retreat from a way of exercising power that Britain could no longer finance. And this retreat had consequences far beyond the docks. Because once naval power is reduced, it cannot be easily restored. Ships take years to build. Crews take years to train. Bases take decades to establish. The decisions made to balance budgets in the late 1942 and early 1950 locked Britain into a narrower future. By the time this reality was fully accepted, the damage was already done. Britain still sailed the seas, but it no longer commanded them. The final stage of this transformation would not be marked by another round of scrapping or budget cuts. It would be defined by acceptance, by a redefinition of Britain's place in the world, shaped not by ambition, but by limits imposed after victory. That acceptance would bring a quieter ending to the story of Britain's naval empire and a lasting lesson about how financial weakness can dismantle power more effectively than any enemy fleet. By the mid-1950s, Britain's naval story was no longer about emergency decisions or reluctant compromises. It had become a settled reality. The age in which Britain could sustain global maritime dominance through its own resources had ended not with a single announcement, but through years of financial necessity, quietly rewriting national ambition. The Navy that remained was still professional, capable, and respected, but it was no longer an imperial instrument. It was a force shaped by limits. This final phase was defined not by further dramatic sales of ships, but by something more profound: acceptance. Britain began to formally redefine what it meant to be a naval power. Instead of global reach, the focus shifted toward regional commitments and alliance cooperation. Instead of independent dominance, Britain adapted to shared security arrangements. Naval planning became defensive rather than expansive. Presence was selective. Intervention was cautious. This transformation was not simply strategic, it was economic. The debts accumulated during World War II continued to influence policy for decades. Servicing those obligations constrained government spending, limited industrial investment, and narrowed military options. Every long-term plan had to account for what Britain could realistically afford, not what history suggested it should command. The consequences extended far beyond the Navy itself. As Britain reduced its maritime footprint, the structure of global trade and security adjusted accordingly. Sea lanes remained open, but responsibility shifted. Strategic choke points were no longer guarded primarily by British ships. Diplomatic influence that once flowed naturally from naval presence now required negotiation and partnership. The empire's dissolution accelerated. Without the naval capacity to project authority and respond quickly across distant regions, maintaining imperial control became politically and economically unsustainable. Decolonization was driven by many forces, but the loss of affordable naval power removed a critical pillar that had once enforced imperial cohesion. What is striking is how little public drama accompanied this change. There was no moment when Britain officially declared the end of its naval empire. Ceremonies continued. Ships still sailed. Traditions were preserved. Yet beneath these symbols, the strategic reality had shifted irreversibly. The sale and scrapping of ships after the war were not acts of weakness in isolation. They were symptoms of a deeper transformation, one in which financial strength, not military courage, determined the limits of power. This story offers a broader lesson. Military power is often measured in hardware, ships, aircraft, bases. But sustaining that power requires economic foundations that can endure peace as well as war. Victory can hide exhaustion. Success can delay reckoning. But debt has a long memory. Britain's experience after World War II demonstrates how even a victorious nation can emerge strategically diminished if the cost of survival exceeds its capacity to recover. Naval supremacy, once lost, proved extraordinarily difficult to rebuild, not because Britain lacked skill or resolve, but because the economic conditions that had once made such supremacy possible no longer existed. In the decades that followed, Britain would continue to play a significant role on the world stage, often through diplomacy, alliances, and selective military engagement. But the era in which its navy alone could underwrite global influence was over. The warships that once symbolized imperial confidence became reminders of a different age. Their sale and dismantling were not betrayals of that legacy, but acknowledgments of reality. This is why the story matters. It challenges the assumption that decline follows defeat. Britain's naval retreat followed victory. It reveals how financial constraints can quietly dismantle power that appears intact on the surface. And it shows that empires do not always fall in battle. Sometimes they are sold ship by ship to pay the bills left behind by survival. In the end, Britain did not lose its navy to an enemy. It lost it to arithmetic. And that may be the most enduring lesson of all.